Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you to the premier event of the year, Starrcade! Back in 1983, Dusty Rhodes, Jim Crockett Jr., and a host of great talents put on the sports entertainment professional wrestling spectacular known as Starrcade. And honest to God, Starrcade 83, 84, even though 84 had its issues, they were basically they were the precursor to WrestleMania. Vince McMahon and co. will like to say that no, WrestleMania, the Colossal Tussle, is what it was supposed to be called. No, really, that's what it was supposed to goddamn be called. How goddamn silly would that have been? Colossal Tussle 41, I don't even think it would have made it past the first. That being said, though, Starrcade, the premier event where wrestlers from all over the goddamn country, seemingly, that weren't tied to the WWF, came in. I mean, hell, they had renowned future, murderer cover-upper guy, Carlos Colon, take on Abdul the Butcher, a guy that couldn't fucking wrestle to save his goddamn life. That being said, though, Starrcade 83, Starrcade 84, unopposed, Vince McMahon growing his goddamn empire. He had WrestleMania 1. Then he had WrestleMania 2. Well, Starrcade 85 was in 2 locations. Then Vince said, ha, I can have WrestleMania 2 in 3 locations. Ha ha! What do you mean it's not working? But that being said, basically, Starrcade 86 was a big success. That was a huge gate, even though Magnum TA's accident put a crunch, a hold basically on the world title possibilities. Well, then we had to switch Nikita babyface. By we, I mean basically Crockett had to switch him babyface. But everything was moving on in a positive direction, and then basically the territories started to go under. We had Championship Wrestling from Florida bought up by Crockett. Even though you could argue he really didn't need to do that, he's doing it for the TV markets. The UWF, the former Mid-South, was bought up. Jim Crockett Promotions was absolutely set up to succeed, and now he needed to have Starrcade 87 be a tremendous success on pay-per-view. And even though Ted Turner had an interest in and would eventually end up owning the company just a year after this, Vince McMahon went to the cable companies and said, you carry that, you won't get to carry WrestleMania 4. I'll be shooting myself in the foot, but they don't know. Ha ha! And yeah, Starrcade 87 wasn't a success. Neither was Bunkhouse Stampede, even though that one, as far as buy rates, did a little bit better. And by the time they got to the Great American Bash 88, and they got full clearance on pay-per-view, yeah, they were having some goddamn issues. Yeah, Jim Crockett would end up having to sell to Ted Turner soon after. But what if Starrcade 87 had been a success? What if they had not been blocked on so many, pay-per-view providers? What if Vince hadn't played hardball and the cable companies had called his goddamn bluff? And what if both promotions had had successful pay-per-views? Would Jim Crockett have had to sell to Ted Turner? What would have happened? Would Dusty Rhodes have been fired as booker after he had the spike stuck in his goddamn eye? Because he was just panicking and everything and blade above his goddamn eye. And, I'll just do this. And what do you mean you're going to fire me? Okay, baby, I'll go do something else. That being said, what if Starrcade 87 had been a raging success? Would Jim Crockett actually still be in business? I don't know. I'm John Rethlin with my real honest thoughts on what if Starrcade 1987 had succeeded. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. So, yeah, give a little bit of a history, even though I kind of did in that really, really, really long intro. I didn't think it would go all that long. But that being said, looking at what Jim Crockett was able to do from the time he got the company or took ownership of the company from his dad, who was in failing health, they were able to basically turn from a tag team territory into more of the singles title stuff. George Scott, back before George Scott lost his goddamn mind, all of these pieces were falling into place. Vince Sr. was running the Northeast territory. They would run events at Shea Stadium. There was the Inoki and Muhammad Ali fight that did not work. There was Chuck Webner and Andre the Giant, I believe. And there was a host of other stuff, simulcast from, closed circuit and everything, broadcast from the Omni, the Superdome, I think the Superdome, and also from Japan and stuff like that. And it was nuts. It was insane. So Vince Sr. was basically just running things as a territory. He was he was just happy to be in his own little bubble. But Vince Jr., the pervert, the dirty pervert, by the way, had ideas of taking the company national and international. And he would do that after buying his father out. And then from there, and I talked about this a bit briefly in my What If Dusty Had Gone to WWF in 1983 video. Check that out. Basically, Vince had this idea of becoming the Walt Disney of professional wrestling. Jim Crockett Promotions, meanwhile, through the 70s, they would have Flair, they would have Steamboat, Valentine, they would have so many great talents come through. And even, with working relationships with Championship Wrestling for Florida, after Eddie Graham passed away, they would do Battle of the Belts, I believe 1, 2, and 3, where they would actually have feuds and they would have some championship matches, and only Tony Khan would understand the concept of that. Battle of the Belts might not be so shit. That being said, Florida was falling on its ass. Florida would have fallen on its ass even if Eddie Graham had lived on. Because to be perfectly honest, it was eroding. Dusty had taken the talent. They were growing some talent, but they were being snatched up. The UWF, or rather, Bill Watts' Mid-South Wrestling had its biggest year in 1984. A lot of the stuff was talked about on the Jim Cornette podcast, Experience and Drive-Thru by him and Brian Last. And Cornette was there in 1984, so he knows all about how successful Mid-South was. Even though 85 was decent, they had the oil bust and everything in Texas and Oklahoma and in the environment, so that caused a constriction on finances. So basically, and that also caused an issue with World Class Championship Wrestling, along with the fact that Fritz basically got too many of his sons involved in wrestling, when really, to be perfectly honest, David, Kevin, and Kerry should have been the only ones in there. Mike should have been in there. Chris may have had love for wrestling, but he was an Oompa Loompa doopity-doo, and he broke his shoulder wrestling for you. Oompa Loompa doopity-dee. It's like when Kerry shot himself by a tree. Why did I do that? Why do I do these things? It is terrible. I shouldn't make fun of that. Boy, Kerry, my left foot, always better than the right one. It's fake. I'm done doing that. Back basically to Starrcade in 1987, or the build to that. So, you had the AWA, like after Wrestle Rock Rumble, or AWA Wrestle Rock. I mean, they had the Super Bowl Shuffle to Wrestle Rock Rumble. After that, they pretty much didn't have anything draw. I mean, Super Clash 2, Electric Boogaloo in 1987 didn't draw for shit. They were at the Cow Palace and you had about 2,500 people. In a building that holds significantly more than that. Now, Jim Crockett Promotions got, the whole thing with Black Saturday and Vince McMahon getting on that and getting $1 million from Jim Crockett Promotions, getting $1 million from Inoki as a booking fee, being able to finance WrestleMania, while Starrcade 83 and Starrcade 84 were raging successes, even with some closed circuit issues and everything, and even with the fact that there was some, I think for 83 there was a snowstorm, which might have affected some of the stuff, but still, they had a pretty goddamn full house, and they made a lot of money, and they were making lots of money, and the thing is, they were starting to spend a whole lot of money, because they would get the private jet, they would do that, they would be more lavish with their spending, and they would go to places, they would market well for some areas. Chicago was good, St. Louis was pretty good, even though St. Louis was on its ass. Central States Territory was really starting to have its issues. They would run places, and they would do pretty well, but then when they would go out to the West Coast, it would cost so much. Jim Crockett was just getting to where he was spending too much. Vince McMahon, meanwhile, eked his way to WrestleMania 1. I still think he probably would have been okay, even if it had just been a middling success, but it was a raging success. We wouldn't have been talking about it we wouldn't still be talking about, the WWF to this day. By the way, I do have this sweet shirt, thanks to my sister, looking at the logo online and painting it, so this is a nice little gift. It's actually one of the nicest shirts I have, and I fondly hold on to it and fondly wear it and proudly wear it. So, basically, all this stuff's going on. These territories are gradually going under, or at least constricting, even though Memphis is doing pretty well in their own little queefdom, as I call them. I know it's thiefdom or fiefdom. I prefer to call it queefdom because I'm just that way. We have Starrcade 85, simulcast from, I believe, the Greensboro Memorial Coliseum and the Omni in Atlanta, which I always thought the Omni in Atlanta had a cool look when you were inside, but that roof is just really weird. It just looks strange. Nevertheless, Mania 1, success. They would have the Wrestling Classic a little bit later that wasn't as much of a success, but I believe it was their first pay-per-view. And The other one was on closed circuit. This was in Starrcade 85, I believe, is closed circuit still. WrestleMania 2 would take the idea of 2 locations, go to 3 locations. It didn't work because I can remember like 2 matches being pretty decent. Dynamite Kid taking the plunge, breaking his back. Oh, you poor abusive piece of shit. That being said, then Starrcade 86 did pretty well, but the aforementioned in the intro, Magnum TA's injury did hamper a little bit of the growth that Jim Crockett Promotions could have. But that being said, they were still doing well. According to Cornette, because it was deposition in a lawsuit, $21 million as far as a gross. They made $21 million in 1986. So they were making that. Now, who knows how much they were spending, but they were making a whole lot of money. The Great American Bash in 1985, going back just a year, that was a big thing. Turned into a big tour in 1986 where they were running some big sports stadiums, have some good crowds. They would run smaller arenas. They would pack them, and they would make a whole lot of money there, and that helped add to the growing amount that would become $21 million in 1986. But then 87 is where things kind of blew up because then they bought these territories. Buying the UWF for $4 million and buying the TV markets and doing that is fine. But they bought Central States, St. Louis. And that was bought back soon after, and nobody knew what the fuck they were doing. Florida was bought up after, I believe, Battle of the Belts 3. And they weren't able to draw for shit anyway. But if they had just bought the UWF and been smarter and curtailed some of the spending, they could have still been in business. But the big thing is to offset all this. If Starrcade 87, let's just go Starrcade 87 now. Basically, a quick rundown of the whole thing. Vince did threaten a lot of the pay-per-view providers. You will not be able to carry WrestleMania 4 or anything in the future if you carry this. They didn't understand, by the way, that he basically was shooting himself in the goddamn foot, but they weren't smart enough to understand this. So they said, sorry, Crockett, you're not going to get to carried here. They got carried on like 4 or 6 providers. One, I think, in San Jose. And I think one in Chicago. They had some, and of course, Vince let them have WrestleMania and stuff like that. He couldn't actually force them because, again, he'd be burning more money, like just in a pile in his goddamn house. Or like just setting fire to his own pants. He'd liar, liar, Vince on fire. One day, hopefully, for all the dirty, perverted shit that he did. But because of that, Starrcade 87 only had like a 20,000 pay-per-view buys. It only had like that kind of mark. And Bunkhouse Stampede, I can't remember if it was like 100,000 or 150,000. They did better, but that was also run in New York where they lost money on the Arena Gate because they ran the Nassau Coliseum. If Starrcade 87 had been a success, say they'd gotten a few $1 million. Say it had been 100 to 150,000 pay-per-view buys. Yeah, they ran it at the UIC Pavilion, I believe. In Chicago, they didn't give the Road Warriors the tag team championships, and they killed Chicago, even though they would do a couple $100,000 gates, I believe, on the Great American Bash Tour in '88. They ran the Chi-Town Rumble in, I believe, also at the UIC Pavilion. That was in 1989, but that was pretty much when the company was basically just all eroding. If Starrcade 87 had been a success and they had gotten a few $1 million, they could have offset some of the losses because they were $2 to $5 million in the hole, depending on what you believe. They could have paid off those debts. And if they had just been smarter with how they were spending, how they were, touring and everything, they could have actually been able to succeed because then the Bunkhouse Stampede would have made them a significant amount of money. They would have been, and that's if Turner had flexed his goddamn muscles back in '87. I mean, I'm not blaming Turner for this because Crockett torpedoed his own business well before Starrcade 87 was going on because they were making money, but they were also spending a whole lot. That $21 million that they made in '86 was only going to carry them so far, depending on what the spending was. And then, so Starrcade 87 didn't succeed. If it had, could have carried them pretty far. Could have carried them to the Bunkhouse Stampede. If they had gotten another pay-per-view instead of the Clash of Champions in April, they would, or maybe if they had even done a pay-per-view in May, they could have done They could have had more successes. They could have, Vince hadn't been playing dirty. Turner had exerted his muscle, or inserted his muscle, as it were. You're welcome for that. He would have been able to, help carry Jim Crockett Promotions, because that's the thing. Jim Crockett Jr. couldn't do it on his own anymore. He proved that he understood enough about business, but not enough to help grow beyond what they had. They could do the occasional tours. The occasional tours weren't the issue. It was the fact that they were spending way too goddamn much. They were letting Dusty go absolutely insane with some of his ideas. And I love Dusty. I said in my previous video. Dusty, Flair, they were locking people into contracts that were like 150, 200 grand a year, which, yes, Crockett was able to afford some of that stuff, but this is another thing it was talked about by Cornette and Last. Like, it was, signed in 88, and Crockett knew he was in trouble because of all the stuff that happened with Starrcade 87 and Bunkhouse Stampede and all that. And even though Great American Bash 88 was a success, by then they were turning things around with the Bash Tour, and they were doing well in the fall. But looking at where they were, their mother had a retirement. They didn't want to risk, her not being able to retire and live comfortably. So they took the payout. Ted Turner bought the company. If Starrcade 87 had succeeded, let me close with this. If it had succeeded, carried the Bunkhouse Stampede, Great American Bash 88 had gone well. If Turner had worked with them and just continued to get them full clearance on pay-per-view, they could have had Starrcade 88 under Jim Crockett Promotions. They could have possibly continued into 89, maybe even into 90. But take a look at who they had in charge. Now, they did have Jim Herd, or the George Scott, they had Jim Herd, they had all these people. If you think that Jim Crockett wasn't able to run a business, he did eventually get burned out. Because think about it, he started running it in 73, essentially, even though John Ringley, and the whole thing about him sleeping with a flight attendant, he was Francis Crockett's significant other until he wasn't. David Crockett was not the king of the wild frontier. David Crockett could not run, a promotion even on beer. I don't know why I said that, but nevertheless. Jim was able to run things and steer the ship. He did get, and he admitted this in, interviews, and I feel bad, rest in peace, Jim Crockett. He knew what he did. And he said, it was my fault. I didn't bring in the right accountants. I didn't bring in the right people. We didn't have the infrastructure that we needed. Pay-per-view money would have only carried them so far. Because Vince just had smarter, business people. He was more ruthless. And even though the Clash of Champions did well, and the second Clash of Champions would have done well if George Scott had bothered to promote it, by the time Starrcade 87's failure was felt, by the time we got to Great American Bash 88, they were already talking to Ted Turner about that. That little period just shows how quickly things can unravel. So even if Starrcade 87 had succeeded, Bunkhouse Stampede, Great American Bash 88, what if by Great American Bash 89, Jim Crockett was still running things? What if things had torpedoed down? What if things had just blown up? Ted Turner would have been able to buy it. Maybe you could argue that Jim Herd would have been in charge of the goddamn thing, and we would have just had a much, 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 much better infrastructure. But overall, I think that Jim Crockett ran it as best he could, spent too much money that he didn't have, thinking that it was going to come in from TV revenue and pay-per-view revenue and all that. And he just eventually self-destructed. So overall, even though Starrcade 87's success would have carried them further, they would have had to constrict it and maybe run Florida all the way up to Virginia, and that's it. They would have just been able to do that, but they would have had to have gone to smaller markets. Because by the time Ted Turner used more influence, Vince was so much further ahead. Because yes, they had that Bash tour. They had that success in the fall. Look what happened in October. They fell down, Arn and Tully left. And Flair almost left at SummerSlam 88. Or for SummerSlam 88. That would have certainly been interesting. And my, oh my, it's just a shame that Jim Crockett wasn't a better businessman, because if he was, pay-per-view successes could have carried that company further. Who knows, maybe they would have been operational into the 90s and we would have not had a Monday Night Wars. Overall, it worked out better for the fans, except the ones that had to suffer through WCW in 1990 through about 93. But Yeah, it's a real shame. Would have carried him? I don't think overall it would have carried him very far, thinking about it. So, let me know your thought. Do you think that Jim Crockett could have been able to carry the company further had Starrcade 87 succeeded? Or do you think it was inevitable that the company was going to collapse? So, like, share, subscribe, Twitter handle in the description. I'm John Rickland. I'll see you soon.